Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna of Russia was the youngest child and younger daughter of Emperor Alexander III of Russia and younger sister of Tsar Nicholas II. She was raised at the Gatchina Palace outside St. Petersburg. Olga's relationship with her mother, Empress Marie, the daughter of King Christian IX of Denmark, was strained and distant from childhood. In contrast, she and her father were close. He died when she was 12, and her brother Nicholas became emperor. In 1901, she married Duke Peter Alexandrovich of Oldenburg, who was privately believed by family and friends to be homosexual. The marriage of 15 years remained unconsummated, and Peter at first refused Olga's request for a divorce. The couple led separate lives, and the marriage was eventually annulled by the emperor in October 1916. The following month Olga married cavalry officer Nikolai Kulikovsky, with whom she had fallen in love several years before. During the First World War, the Grand Duchess served as an army nurse at the front and was awarded a medal for personal gallantry. At the downfall of the Romanovs in the Russian Revolution of 1917, she fled to the Crimea with her husband and children, where they live under the threat of assassination. Her brother and his family were shot by revolutionaries. Olga escaped revolutionary Russia with her second husband and the two sons in February 1920. They joined her mother, the Dowager Empress, in Denmark. In exile, Olga acted as companion and secretary to her mother, and was often sought out by Romanov impostors who claimed to be her dead relatives. She met Anna Anderson, the best-known impostor, in Berlin in 1925. After the Dowager Empress's death in 1928, Olga and her husband purchased a dairy farm in Ballerup, near Copenhagen. She led a simple life, raising her two sons, working on the farm and painting. During her lifetime, she painted over 2,000 works of art, which provided extra income for both her family and the charitable causes she supported. In 1948, feeling threatened by Joseph Stalin's regime, Olga emigrated with her immediate family to a farm in Ontario, Canada. With advancing age, Olga and her husband moved to a bungalow near Cooksville, Ontario. Colonel Kulikovsky died there in 1958. 2 years later, as her health deteriorated, Olga moved with devoted friends to a small apartment in East Toronto. She died aged 78, 7 months after her older sister, Xenia. At the end of her life and afterwards, Olga was widely labeled the last Grand Duchess of Imperial Russia. Early life. Olga was the youngest daughter of Tsar Alexander III and his consort, Marie Feodorovna, formerly Princess Dagmar of Denmark. She was born in the Purple Eye during her father's reign, on the 13th of June 1882 in the Peterhof Palace, west of central St. Petersburg. Her birth was announced by a traditional 101-gun salute from the ramparts of the Peter and Paul Fortress, and similar salutes throughout the Russian Empire. Her mother, advised by her sister, Alexandra, Princess of Wales, placed Olga in the care of an English nanny, Elizabeth Franklin. The Russian imperial family was a frequent target for assassins, so for safety reasons the Grand Duchy was raised at the country palace of Gatchina, about 50 miles west of St. Petersburg. Olga and her siblings, however, were not accustomed to a lavish early lifestyle. Conditions in the nursery were modest, even Spartan. They slept on hard camp beds, rose at dawn, washed in cold water, and ate a simple porridge for breakfast. Olga left Gatchina for the first time in the early fall of 1888 when the imperial family visited the Caucasus. On the 29th of October, the return train approached the small town of Bauk at speed. Olga's parents and the 4 older children children were eating lunch in the dining car when the train lurched violently and came off the rails. The carriage was torn open, the heavy iron roof caved in, and the wheels and floor of the car were sliced off. The Tsar crawled out from beneath the crushed roof and held it up with a Herculean effort, so that the others could escape. There were 21 fatalities. Empress Marie helped tend the wounded, and made makeshift bandages from her own clothes. An official investigation found that the crash was an accident, but it was widely assumed that 2 bombs had been planted on the line. The Grand Duchess and her siblings were taught at home by private tutors. Subjects included history, geography, Russian, English and French, as well as drawing and dancing. Physical activities such as equestrianism were taught at an early age, and they became expert riders. The family was deeply religious. Although Christmas and Easter were times of celebration and extravagance, Lent was strictly observed. Meat, dairy products and any form of entertainment were avoided. Family holidays were taken in the summer at Peterhof and with Olga's grandparents in Denmark. Empress Marie was reserved and formal with Olga as a child, and the relationship remained a difficult one. However, Olga, her father, and the youngest of her brothers, Michael, had a close relationship. Together, the three frequently went on hikes within the Gatchina forests where the Tsar taught Olga and Michael woodsmanship. Olga said of her father, "My father was everything to me. Immersed in work as he was, he always spared that daily half hour. Once my father showed me a very old album full of most exciting pen and ink sketches of an imaginary city called Mopsopolis, inhabited by mopses. He showed it to me in secret, and I was thrilled to have him share his own childhood secrets with me." During 1894, Olga's father became increasingly ill, and the annual trip to Denmark was cancelled. On the 13th of November 1894, he died at the age of 49. The emotional impact on Olga, aged only 12, was traumatic, and her eldest brother, the new Tsar Nicholas II, was propelled into a role for which in Olga's later opinion he was ill-prepared. Court life. Olga was due to enter society in the summer of 1899, but after the death of her brother George at the age of 27, her first official public appearance was delayed by a year until 1900. She hated the experience, and later told her official biographer Ian Vors, "I felt as though I were an animal in a cage, exhibited to the public for the first time." From 1901, Olga was appointed honorary commander-in-chief of the 12th Aktorski Hussar Regiment of the Imperial Russian Army. The Aktorski Hussars were famous for the victory over Napoleon Bonaparte at the Battle of Kulm in 1813, and wore a distinctive brown dolman. By 1900, Olga, age 18, was being escorted to the theatre and opera by a distant cousin, Duke Peter Alexandrovich of Oldenburg, a member of the Russian branch of the House of Oldenburg. He was 14 years her senior and known for his passion for literature and gambling. Peter asked for Olga's hand in marriage the following year, a proposal that took the Grand Duchess completely by surprise. "I was so taken aback that all I could say was, 'Thank you,'" she later explained. Their engagement, announced in May 1901, was unexpected by family and friends, as Peter had shown no prior interest in women, and members of society assumed he was homosexual. At the age of 19, on the 9th of August 1901, Olga married 33-year-old Peter. After the celebration, the newlyweds left for the Oldenburg Palace on the Field of Mars. Olga spent her wedding night alone in tears, while her husband left for a gambling club, returning the next morning. The marriage remained unconsummated, and Olga suspected that Peter was pushed into proposing by his ambitious anxious mother. Biographer Patricia Phoenix thought Olga may have accepted his proposal to gain independence from her own mother, the Dowager Empress, or avoid marriage into a foreign court. The couple initially lived with her in-laws Alexander Petrovich and Eugenie Maximilianovna of Oldenburg. It was not an harmonious arrangement, as Peter's parents, both well known for their philanthropic work, berated their only son for his laziness. Eugenie, a close friend of the Dowager Empress, showered her daughter-in-law with gifts, including a ruby tiara that had been a present to Josephine de Beauharnais from Napoleon. But Olga took a dislike towards her mother-in-law. A few weeks after the wedding, Olga and her husband traveled to Biarritz, France, from where they sailed to Sorrento, Italy, on a yacht loaned to them by King Edward VII of Great Britain. On the return to Russia, they settled into a 200-room palace at 46 Sergievskaya Street, St. Petersburg. The palace, a gift from Tsar Nicholas II to his sister, now houses the St. Petersburg Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Olga and Peter had separate bedrooms at opposite ends of the building, and the Grand Duchess had her own art studio. Unhappy in her marriage, she fell into bouts of depression that caused her to lose her hair, forcing her to wear a wig. It took 2 years for her hair to regrow. Near the Oldenburgs' estate, Ramon in Voronezh province, Olga had her own villa, called Olgino, after the local town. She subsidized the village school out of her own pocket, and established a hospital. Her daughter-in-law later wrote, "She tried to help every needy person as far as her strengths and means would permit. At the hospital, she learned basic medical treatment and proper care from the local doctor. She exemplified her strong Orthodox faith by creating religious icons, which she distributed to the charitable endeavors she supported." At Ramon, Olga and Peter enjoyed walking through the nearby woods and hunted wolves together. He was kind and considerate towards her, but she longed for love, a normal marriage and children. In April 1903, she was introduced to a Blue Cuirassier Guards officer Nikolai Kulikovsky by her brother Michael during a royal military review at Pavlovsk Palace. Olga and Kulikovsky began to see each other and exchange letters regularly. The same year, at the age of 22, she confronted her husband and asked for a divorce, which he refused with the qualification that he might reconsider after 7 years. Nevertheless, Oldenburg appointed Kulikovsky as an aide-de-camp, and allowed him to live in the same residence as Oldenburg and the Grand Duchess on Sergievskaya Street. The relationship between Kulikovsky and the Grand Duchess was not public, but gossip about the romance spread through society. From 1904 to 1906, Duke Peter was appointed to a military post in Tsarskoye Selo, a complex of palaces just south of St. Petersburg. In Tsarskoye Selo, the Grand Duchess grew close to her brother Nicholas and his family, who lived at the Alexander Palace near her own residence. Olga prized her connection to the Tsar's 4 daughters. From 1906 to 1914, Olga took her nieces to parties and engagements in St. Petersburg, without the parents, every weekend throughout the winter. She especially took a liking to the youngest of Nicholas's daughters, her goddaughter Anastasia, whom she called Shvipsik. Through her brother and sister-in-law, Olga met Rasputin, a self-styled holy man who purported to have healing powers. Although she made no public criticisms of Rasputin's association with the imperial family, she was unconvinced of his supposed powers and privately disliked him. As Olga grew close to her brother's family, her relationship with her other surviving brother, Michael, deteriorated. To her and Nicholas's horror, Michael eloped with his mistress, a twice-divorced commoner, and communication between Michael and the rest of the family was essentially cut off. Public unrest over the Russo-Japanese War and demands for political reform increased in the early years of the 20th century. At Epiphany 1905, a band of revolutionaries fired live rounds at the Winter Palace from the Peter and Paul fortress. Olga and the Dowager Empress were showered with glass splinters from a smashed window, but were unharmed. 3 weeks later, on Bloody Sunday, at least 92 people were killed by Cossack troops during a demonstration, and a month later Olga's uncle, Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich of Russia, was assassinated. Uprisings occurred throughout the country, and parts of the Navy mutiny. Olga supported the appointment of the liberal Pyotr Stolypin as prime minister, and he embarked on a program of gradual reform. But in 1911 he was assassinated. The public unrest, Michael's elopement, and Olga's sham marriage placed her under strain, and in 1912, while visiting England with her mother, she suffered a nervous breakdown. Tsarina Alexandra was also unwell with fatigue, concerned by the poor health of her hemophiliac son, Alexei. Olga stood in for the Tsarina at public events, and accompanied her brother on a tour of the interior, while the Tsarina remained at home. War and Revolution. On the 1st of August 1914, just before the start of World War I, Olga's regiment, the Aktorsky Hussars, appeared at an imperial review before her and the Tsar at Krasno Selo. Kulikovsky volunteered for service with the Hussars, who were stationed on the front lines in southwestern Russia. With the Grand Duchess's prior medical knowledge from the village of Olgino, she started work as a nurse at an understaffed Red Cross hospital in Rovno, near to where her own regiment was stationed. During the war, she came under heavy Austrian fire while attending the regiment at the front. Nurses rarely work so close to the front lines, and consequently she was awarded the Order of St. George by General Mannerheim, who later became President of Finland. As the Russians lost ground to the Central Powers, Olga's hospital was moved eastwards to Kiev, and Michael returned to Russia from exile abroad. In 1916, Tsar Nicholas II officially annulled the marriage between Duke Peter Alexandrovich and the Grand Duchess, allowing her to marry Colonel Kulikovsky. The service was performed on 16 November 1916 in the Kievo-Vasilievskaya Church on Trikosvietitelskaya in Kiev. The only guests were the Dowager Empress, Olga's brother-in-law Grand Duke Alexander, 4 officers of the Aktorsky Regiment, and 2 of Olga's fellow nurses from the hospital in Kiev. During the war, internal tensions and economic deprivation in Russia continued to mount, and revolutionary sympathies grew. After Tsar Nicholas II abdicated in early 1917, many members of the Romanov dynasty, including Nicholas and his immediate family, were detained under house arrest. In search of safety, the Dowager Empress, Grand Duke Alexander, and Grand Duchess Olga traveled to the Crimea by special train, where they were joined by Olga's sister Grand Duchess Senior. They lived at Alexander's estate, Itidor, about 12 miles from Yalta, where they were placed under house arrest by the local forces. On the 12th of August 1917, her first child and son, Tikhon Nikolaevich, was born during the virtual imprisonment. He was named after Tikhon of Zadansk, the saint venerated near the Grand Duchess's estate at Olgino. Although Tikhon was the grandson of an emperor and the nephew of another, neither he nor his younger brother Guri received any title, as his father was a commoner. The Romanovs, isolated in the Crimea, knew little of the fate of the Tsar and his family. Nicholas, Alexandra, and the children were originally held at their official residence, the Alexander Palace, but the provisional government under Alexander Kerensky relocated them to Tobolsk, Siberia. In February 1918, most of the imperial family at Tydor was moved to another estate at Ulba, where Grand Dukes Nicholas and Peter were already under house arrest. Olga and her husband were left at Tydor. The entire Romanov family in the Crimea was condemned to death by the Yalta Revolutionary Council, but the executions were delayed by political rivalry between the Yalta and Sevastopol Soviets. By March 1918, the Central Power of Germany had advanced on the Crimea, and the Revolutionary Guards were replaced by German ones. In November 1918, the German forces were informed that the nation had lost the war, and they evacuated homewards. Allied forces took over the Crimean ports in support of the Loyalist White Army, which temporarily allowed the surviving members of the Romanov family time to escape abroad. The Dowager Empress, and at her insistence, most of her family and friends were evacuated by the British warship HMS Marlborough. Nicholas II, however, had already been shot dead, and the family assumed, correctly, that his wife and children had also been killed. Unknown to her, Olga's childhood confidant and brother Michael, Nicholas II's supposed successor, had been assassinated near Perm on 13 June 1918. Olga and her husband refused to leave Russia, and decided to move to the Caucasus, which the White Army had cleared of revolutionary Bolsheviks. An imperial bodyguard, Timofey Yachik, guided them to his hometown, the large Cossack village of Novominskaya. In a rented 5-room farmhouse there, Olga gave birth to her second son, Yuri Nikolaevich, on 23 April 1919. He was named after a friend of hers, Yuri Panyev, who was killed while serving in the Aktarsky Regiment during World War I. In November 1919, the family set out on what would be the last journey through Russia. Just ahead of revolutionary troops, they escaped to Novorossiysk, and took refuge in the residence of the Danish consul, Thomas Schitt, who informed them of the Dowager Empress's safe arrival in Denmark. After a brief stay with the consul, the family were shipped to a refugee camp on the island of Buyukada in the Dardanelles Strait near Istanbul, Turkey, where Olga, her husband and children shared 3 rooms with 11 other adults. After 2 weeks, they were evacuated to Belgrade in the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes, where she was visited by Regent Alexander Karageorgievich, later King Alexander I of Yugoslavia. Alexander offered the Grand Duchess and her family a permanent home, but Olga was summoned to Denmark by her mother. On Good Friday 1920, Olga and her family arrived in Copenhagen. They lived with the Dowager Empress, at first at the Amalienborg Palace and then at the royal estate of Vidor, where Olga acted as her mother's secretary and companion. It was a difficult arrangement at times. The Dowager Empress insisted on having Olga at her beck and call, and found Olga's young sons too boisterous, having never reconciled with the idea of her daughter's marriage to a commoner. She was cold towards Kulikovsky, rarely allowing him in her presence. At formal functions, Olga was expected to accompany her mother alone. Anna Anderson. In 1925, Olga and Colonel Kulikovsky traveled to Berlin to meet Anna Anderson, who claimed to be Olga's niece, Grand Duchess Anastasia Nikolaevna of Russia. Anderson had attempted suicide in Berlin in 1920, which Olga later called probably the only indisputable fact in the whole story. Anderson claimed that with the help of a man named Tchaikovsky she had escaped from revolutionary Russia via Bucharest, where she had given birth to his child. Olga thought the story palpably false, since Anderson made no attempt to approach Queen Marie of Romania during her entire alleged time in Bucharest. Olga said, if Mrs. Anderson had indeed been Anastasia, Queen Marie would have recognized her on the spot. Marie would never have been shocked at anything, and a niece of mine would have known it. There is not one tittle of genuine evidence in the story. The woman keeps away from the one relative who would have been the first to recognize her, understand her desperate plight, and sympathize with her. Anderson stated she was in Berlin to inform Princess Irene of Prussia of her survival. Olga commented it was one of the most straight-laced women in her generation. My niece would have known that her condition would have indeed have shocked. Olga met Anderson, who was being treated for tuberculosis at a nursing home. Of the visit, Olga later said, "My beloved Anastasia was 15 when I saw her for the last time in the summer of 1916. She would have been 24 in 1925. I thought Mrs. Anderson looked much older than that. Of course, one had to make allowances for a very long illness. All the same, my niece's features could not possibly have altered out of all recognition. The nose, the mouth, the eyes were all different. As soon as I sat down by the bed in the Mommsen nursing home, I knew I was looking at a stranger. I had left Denmark with something of a hope in my heart. I left Berlin with all hope extinguished." In addition, Olga said she was dismayed that Anderson spoke only German and showed no sign of knowing either English or Russian, while Anastasia spoke both those languages fluently and was ignorant of German. Nevertheless, Olga remained sympathetic towards Anderson, perhaps because she thought that she was ill rather than deliberately deceitful. Olga later explained, "She did not strike me as an out-and-out imposter. Her brusqueness warred against it. Her cunning impostor would have done all she could to ingratiate herself. But Mrs. Anderson's manner would have put anyone off. My own conviction is that it all started with some unscrupulous people who hoped they might lay their hands on at least a share of the fabulous and utterly non-existent Roman of fortune." I had a feeling she was briefed, as it were, but far from perfectly. The mistakes she made could not all be attributed to lapses of memory. For instance, she had a scar on one of her fingers and she kept telling everybody that it had been crushed because of a footman shutting the door of a landau too quickly. And at once I remembered the real incident. It was Marie, her elder sister, who got her hand hurt rather badly, and it did not happen in a carriage but on board the imperial train. Obviously someone, having heard something of the incident, had passed a garbled version of it to Mrs. Anderson. Conceivably, Olga was initially either open to the possibility that Anderson was Anastasia or unable to make up her mind. Anderson's biographer and supporter Peter Kurth claimed that Olga wrote to the Danish ambassador, Herluf Zalle, at the end of October 1925. "My feeling is that she is not the one she believes, but one can't say she is not as a fact. However, within a month she had made up her mind. She wrote to a friend, 'There is no resemblance, and she is undoubtedly not a.' Olga sent Anderson a scarf and 5 letters, which were used by Anderson's supporters to claim that Olga recognized Anderson as Anastasia. Olga later said she sent the gift and letters out of pity and called the claims a complete fabrication. When Olga refused to recognize Anderson as Anastasia publicly and published a statement denying any resemblance in a Danish newspaper, Anderson's supporters, Harriet von Rathleff and Gleb Botkin, claimed that Olga was acting on instructions received from her sister Xenia by telegram, which Olga denied in private letters and sworn testimony. She told her official biographer, "I never received any such telegram." The supposed telegram was never produced by Anderson's supporters, and it has never been found among any of the papers relating to the case. Xenia said, "Told the most terrible lies about my sister and me. I was supposed to have sent Olga a telegram saying, 'On no account recognize Anastasia.' That was a fantasy. I never sent any telegrams, or gave my sister any advice about her visit to Berlin. We were all apprehensive about the wisdom of her going, but only because we feared it would be used for propaganda purposes by the claimant's supporters. My sister Olga felt sorry for that poor woman. She was kind to her, and because of her kindness of heart, her opinions and motives have been misrepresented.